Welcome to today's webinar. As a global consulting firm, Protiviti is here to help you connect, grow, succeed. We invite you to visit us online at protiviti.com/webinars to find other great content and subscribe. Now, let's begin.
Hello, and welcome to Protiviti's Navigating Resilience and Mitigating Third-Party Risk webinar. We're so glad you're here and hope you will find the material meaningful and insightful. Before we begin, a couple housekeeping items for everybody's reminders here. Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge are the recommended browsers. If you're having any trouble with the webinar viewing, please log off and log back on using one of the preferred browsers. If you continue to experience any issues, please try refreshing your browser or message us in the Q&A box. Also, please also use the Q&A box to submit questions. We will respond to as many submitted questions as time permits throughout the session. And thank you to all the pre-submitted questions, and we'll try to cover those throughout the conversation today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. Please check out the Resource Center on your screen for other great materials, and that's also where you'll find the materials presented today, including the PowerPoint as well as speaker bios. Let's kick off with a quick introduction of our speakers. My name is Brian Kostick. I'm the Managing Director within Protiviti's Risk and Compliance Practice and responsible for our financial services industry segment. As part of my responsibilities, I focus on end-to-end third-party risk management across various risk domains. Next, I'll let Doug introduce himself, and then we'll go with Tom after that. Doug?
Thanks, Brian. Doug Wilbert. I'm a managing director in our New York office. I lead our banking and capital markets efforts, and I also do a lot of work in the resilience space. A lot of the third-party risk that we'll talk about today is risk of revolving around resilience and where regulators are looking towards for firms to, let's say, step up and understand the risk a little better in the third-party space. Look forward to the conversations and look forward to answering all your questions. Tom?
Thanks, Doug. Hi, my name's Tom Wagner. Thanks for having me here today. So just by way of background, I'm a managing director here at SIFMA. I cover cyber, BCP, operational resilience, and third-party risk management. And then, for those of you not familiar with SIFMA, we're a trade association. We're an advocate for the financial services industry. We have over 500 members, including the world's largest banks, investment banks, brokerages, and asset managers. And we've been working with Protiviti for several years now on many strategic engagements, including our, global Quantum Dawn exercise series. So thank you and welcome.
All right, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Doug. We're going to jump right into the topic since we've got a loaded agenda today. I'm going to start with just some basics on third-party risk, kind of set the stage, and then we'll jump into the topic that Doug mentioned, kind of more focused on the resilience piece. So I want to just set the stage for everybody real quickly in terms of third-party risk management around the world. Certainly this is angled more towards financial services, but as we get into other industries, the topic still is very relevant and very, I would say the third-party piece on the financial services angle is really leading the way in terms of what setting the standards would be. I will candidly say that this slide was developed about 3 months ago, and it's already likely out of date based on the constant movement of third-party guidance on a global scale. We have certainly seen over the past 5 years in particular a continual updating process taking place across various regulatory jurisdictions and the regulatory bodies focusing on a number of net new topics within the third-party risk management space. But with that being said, if you are a global organization, the advantage is most of the guidance that we're talking about on the screen is focused on holistic third-party risk management. And with that, 80% of the topic is usually around the same. You may have some different terminology, but ultimately the life cycle and the components that most of the regulatory bodies are asking for is pretty consistent. That being said, the 20% that we're talking about that are unique jurisdictional requirements, those are the ones that every program needs to be considerate of based on where you operate and which regulatory bodies are applicable to you. And that's where you're specifically seeing a lot of those net new requirements around either concentration risk reporting, registry requirements, and we'll get into a lot of detail on that in the coming slides, or other programistic specific requirements that would be focused on either governance, reporting, or just lifecycle management as a whole. As we think about third-party risk management trends as a whole, again, there's a couple key things I'll call out on this slide, and there's a lot that we could go into in detail here. But just to level set, a couple of key things, and no matter what you do from a global perspective, these are things that you're always going to have. So first and foremost, having a complete and accurate inventory with descriptions of your third parties and the associated services. That is table stakes for every good third-party risk management program. And as we see more and more often, because of the registry requirements that are being put on based on a variety of different regulatory jurisdictions, the underlying data model to support being able to report that complete inventory is an absolute must, and being able to continue to adapt that data model to take into account both legal entity considerations, business unit considerations, as well as contractual considerations is a really important component of a successful third-party risk management program today. Additionally, and we'll get into this in a lot more detail in the coming slides, but there is a perception of most programs being a check-the-box exercise today. And that check-the-box exercise is more historical in nature based on a lot of the trends that have taken place over the last 10 years in terms of creating repeatable processes for lower-level resources to execute and be able to complete various life cycle requirements, whether it's inherent risk assessments, due diligence requirements, or broader risk assessment activities that take place. The challenge with the check the box exercise oftentimes is we're asking questions that ultimately don't drive a lot of results, and we're having a lot of challenges in getting good information from our third parties. So that first bullet is really what we're talking about today. Focusing on the 5%, and every organization is going to have a different percentage here. It's just meant to be indicative of where the industry needs to go. But the point of it is, if you have third parties that you can't live without, and those third parties are creating, ultimately risks that you need to be able to manage and mitigate on a long-term basis or a short-term basis, focusing your program on those third parties is where your focus should be. And the other 80, 85, 90%, depending on what that number is for every organization, are things that you can likely continue to use more holistic check the box type exercises to be able to then flow those through your program. Meanwhile, making sure that meaningful output is achieved across all of your segments and all of your industry focused needs. Last point I'll just make, and this was a question that got brought up several times through our pre-screening here, or pre-questions based on the webinar invite, was around what is the right model. And the top bottom right box here in terms of stakeholder support and knowledge is an absolutely critical consideration in terms of what is the right operating model for your third-party risk management program, whether that's centralized, whether that's decentralized, is it a hybrid. There's been certainly a lot of trending in this space over the past 10 years in terms of trying a model that was likely more decentralized initially, realizing that the stakeholders involved didn't have the skill sets to effectively manage risk. There was naturally kind of a push to bring things back in centrally. And now it's getting more back into that hybrid world where we're realizing that we need strong governance from a second and first line function. Depending on your size and scope, you may have a shared service function in the first line that's actually executing a lot of the day-to-day activities, including the risk oversight. If you're a smaller organization, you likely don't have that, and you're probably operating with more of a centralized team that's doing it all. Either model is okay. What's the most important component here is, do you have the right people with the right skill sets identifying, managing, and measuring and mitigating those risks? And more often than not, this is where third-party risk management programs fall down, because at the end of the day, they're asking people that maybe don't have the right skill sets to be able to identify and review risks of those third parties. And that ultimately drives a lot of ineffective oversight and maybe, candidly missed risks that aren't either are or are not materialized throughout the program. So that's a lot right there. And obviously there's things that go along with this that from a trending perspective will continue to evolve. One of the key things within this is obviously AI as well, and AI being a key driver within understanding where AI is going to play a role within your third parties and how that will ultimately deliver different products, different services to you as an organization, and then what you're comfortable and how you manage those risks. The last point just to make real quickly in terms of level setting on third-party risk, I understand that we're not going to go through every bullet, nor should we on this webinar. Again, these materials are available to download if you would like them. The key component here is, and this is something that, for those of you that have joined our webinars in the past, you've probably seen this circle graphic on the right-hand side. The key update this year is adding in those resilience requirements across the life cycle. And again, that's something that most third-party risk management programs are trying to figure out how to build in more operational resilience elements throughout the life cycle. Again, that goes back to that hybrid model that we were talking about, and making sure that as we work through all the key stages, whether that's planning, initial risk assessment, or inherent risk assessment, into due diligence, through contracting, into monitoring, all of those activities have to have the right stakeholders involved, and that's likely going to require your subject matter experts within the second line and the first line to be part of that process. So that's a very quick, high-level view of third-party risk management. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk about what he's seeing from an industry lens in terms of how third-party relates to operational resilience, and really providing that industry view on where things are going today. Tom?
Thanks, Brian. So, just a little history here, some background context on, some of the operational resilience third-party risks we're facing today. So, I think you may all remember the Equifax data breach. This is back, 2017, but this was really a big wake-up call for the financial industry. You had credit bureau information for, nearly 150 million Americans compromised. And at the time, this is really one of the largest cyber crimes, resulted in a significant number of identity thefts. And as of today, over 20 billion records have been lost to cyber criminals over the past 10 years, so affecting more than half of the American public. But recently, though, the tide has turned, right, from selling data breach information to ransomware. Much more lucrative for state actors, but it's really become the biggest threat to both the financial sector, other industries as well, most notably healthcare and governments. And but I just want to focus a little bit on our industry. We've had a number of ransomware outages of late, impacting critical third parties, as well as the global financial markets. It just kind of brings up the question: what do we mean by a critical third party, right? Regulators, they've been focused on critical third parties for some time now, but what we learned during some of these outages is that the third parties that were impacted may not have been deemed critical. They were kind of operating under the radar, insignificant market share. Their users had backup plans in place, but collectively, due to the number of users, the outage had significant impacts to the financial markets. And the problem, though, is due to the type of ransomware involved. Recovery times for these events, they were measured in days and sometimes weeks, as many of these firms just didn't have good immutable data backups they could rely upon, and just had to go through the whole decision process. Do we pay the ransom? Do we not pay the ransom? So as a result, regulatory oversight has really shifted now more towards third parties who the entire industry relies upon. These are our critical financial market infrastructure, financial market utilities, where there's no substitutability. Some of these now reside in the cloud. And so how do we begin to assess, third-party systemic risks and cloud concentration risks? And, the key issue here is, how do we obtain greater transparency, what's going on with these third parties? They'll have NDAs. They can't legally divulge who their customers are, what critical functions they're performing for the industry. And they certainly won't, expose their ability to recover, under extreme but plausible scenarios. So, these are some big issues we're facing with regards to third parties, kind of this overall lack of transparency. And that's really the focus of today's webinar, which is, how do we get through this? How do we build more resilience at both the firm and the sector level, working with our third parties, our government partners, and law enforcement around the world? So thank you, welcome, and back over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tom. And I guess, Doug, any additional context that you would like to add here in terms of more of the operational risk or operational resilience principles as a whole?
What are some of the measurements um, that should be in place to validate third parties are complying with contract terms and safeguarding information for the organization? One of the things that Tom brought up, I guess, if you read into his words, is there's a lot we don't know about what our third parties are doing. Um, so if you can take the largest cloud provider, or you can take a bank. We assume because somebody is AWS or a Morgan Stanley like firm that they're a gold standard and they know everything that's going on. When you kick the tires, that may not actually be the case, and especially market utilities where there's a significant concentration risk of services, that poses a very real large threat. Additionally, a lot of the SLAs and the rights within SLAs and the rights within the contract, especially in cloud providers, are not indicative of the capabilities of the organization, and especially early contracts in the cloud space have been designed to benefit the cloud provider. People were rushing so quickly to get to AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, and they had such power over the sector that they were able to get favorable contract terms in there. Now, so reason why I'm saying that is ultimately speaking, SLAs are a great way to make sure that they're doing the right thing, but they may not be applicable, they may not be real, and frankly, they may be at the benefit of the person who's providing the service. So in terms of understanding what to measure, the question that we received is on the safeguarding of information for the organization. So immediately I think of cyber event and not releasing PII. I think firms have a very strong hold on that, but I think in adverse events, things will happen. And we're always going to get a note that there was a data breach and that our lease payments or whatever were sent out. And now we have a $25 back or a free year of cybersecurity for our social security number. The reality is that's never going away. It's only going to get worse, but firms are doing everything they can on the PII side. Where I would be more worried is if an event occurred, how quickly can the organization come back to make sure that you can maintain the service with them? I'm more worried about not being able to make a payment because my bank is out for 3 weeks than I am about my address being on the internet somewhere. I can buy insurance for my information being on the internet, although it's cumbersome. If I can't make payments and I can't access my money, I'm much more worried. In terms of what metrics, ultimately speaking, at an individual level, we're not going to get them. And part of the work that we're doing and with SIFMA is trying to have regulators give us a bit more information on how these very critical firms are managing their uptime and their ability to recover so that we understand more about exactly what risk is and where it lies within the system.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that point up, Doug, because when I think about resilience as a topic, just as a whole, right, it very much is an enterprise view. And I think when we get into some of these larger third parties that likely have an influence or an impact on a lot of our global FIs, as well as, frankly, regional FIs as well, it certainly turns into much more of a broader topic based on the services that they provide, right? So the cloud providers are probably a unique example where you've got relatively targeted services, but it impacts a wide breadth of services because of what they do. Whereas you get into some of the other third parties that are out there and they've got, tens of hundreds of operating services that they support FIs with. And some of those are probably have relatively mature resiliency programs in place and can continue to support those programs and be able to get up faster if they had an incident or an outage, whereas others don't have that same focus, right? And so when we think about alignment of resiliency as a topic, it does really translate a bit to what do we view as an FI from our perspective, our resilience capabilities, and what do we need our resilience capabilities to be? And then also translating that to do our key third parties, our critical third parties, our important third parties, whatever terminology you want to use on a global basis, because it all means the same thing. are those third parties having the same capabilities and expectations that we have on our own program? And have they proven that out in a manner that's a meaningful capacity? And Tom, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this, but you mentioned it earlier in terms of challenges with resiliency in terms of events where it's, hey, there's probably RTOs in some of these contracts that say that, they'll be up in 4 hours. They actually have an event. The event takes place. Now we're talking about days or if not weeks in terms of full recoverability, and being able to kind of translate to, are there actually penalty provisions that are meaningful, right? Are there, maybe a different way to put it, are there incentives in place for the third parties to really bring their programs to the level that we need them to be for true infrastructure support versus, if they miss the RTO, like they miss the RTO, what's going to happen, right? Is there really that downstream ability to influence that in the right way? I guess curious to get your thoughts on that, Tom.
Yeah, tough, challenging times. I mean, but part of the issues around, having a third party be able to recover, we mentioned it was just, lack of a good immutable, database that they could rely upon. And, we keep harping on this with our members, in terms of ransomware. But what happened in one instance, critical third party that services some of the financial, the derivatives markets. So had 20, 25 users. All those users, that their plan B was to go manual. So they continued to trade. They pulled out old trade blotters. They continued to trade manually while the systems were down. And so part of the issue was not so much the recovery of the third party itself, but then how do you reconcile the thousands and thousands of trades that occurred over time while the third party was getting back up and operational. And so some of these issues were directly related to the third party, but some of them are structural within the industry itself. Some of the other issues we found, particularly in the cloud too, you could have, even in the same availability zone, multiple processes, some which may be more critical to the recovery of the financial sector than others. But from a cloud point of view, their impetus is, let's get everything back up and operational as quickly as possible. But from a financial sector point of view, what we've been saying to the cloud providers is like, look, we need to provide you with some guidance. If there's an outage on a server or availability zone, we would like, this third party to come up first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So, and just trying to understand, the interdependencies of, what's in the cloud and getting that kind of transparency, from a sector point of view of things that we need to know. That last story. So I was in internal audit for a couple of years, major financial institution, and, they sent me down, to India, spent some time with a third party just to, assess their recovery processes. And, we would have thought, given our stature in the industry and all the clients this third party had, that if there's a major outage, we would be first in line in terms of recovery. And during the audit process, I got handed a document which they probably shouldn't have given to me, but actually learned the recovery priorities overall, and we were like fifth in line, and some of the other firms that were ahead of us weren't even in financial services and seemed less critical to us. So, doing these kinds of audits and really understanding, where you stand in terms of, recovery is something, you need to have as part of your third-party risk management program. So, have a lot of those stories I could tell, but let me just stop here.
I mean, that probably could be its own webinar right there, Tom. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
And just don't forget too, fourth parties. They're like the backup quarterback that nobody knows, but if they get put in the game and things go wrong, they're vilified forever. The cloud never goes out. The cloud never goes out until Akamai went out. Then Google Cloud went out. So it's knowing the fourth parties is hard. That's like finding Waldo. That's not an easy thing to do.
That's right. And I think, Doug, you've used the analogy several times over the years of the cruise ship piece. And, I think that's a really easy way to kind of think about it in terms of, are there enough seats on the life rafts, right, to be able to get everybody through the process at the end if a cruise ship's going down, right? And it's kind of that, if you translate it to payment processing and transactions, can the rails that are the backup rails take all the volume that would be expected if something was to happen, right? And I think, this slide in particular, it's kind of a demonstration of where we've kind of moved on thinking about concentration risk as we think about third-party providers. And Doug, I'll let you talk about it in more detail, but it certainly, I think, is a good indicator of thinking about where we have infrastructure risk across the industry comparatively to maybe individual risk at an organizational level. And that organizational level still may have, critical third parties, and the cloud providers being a good example of that, where, each of us probably has a choice when we go through the process of selecting who we want to choose there. But once you choose, you've chosen, and you're kind of tied to that, and it's going to be really hard to get out of that or transition to another service provider at that point in time. So, and Doug, I'll let you kind of explain the principles here, but I think this certainly kicks off the next wave of the conversation.
Yeah, and what this was a way not to think about designations of SIFMU or SIFI or utility or infrastructure, but a way to think about risk. And the reason why we're differentiating it is, to Brian's point, if I want to clear trades, I have to go to the DTCC. I don't have a choice. They're a market utility. They're designated as such. They have a lot of regulations. But if I'm going to clear trades, that's where I have to go. They essentially, will say, have a monopoly. If I want to use a cloud provider, I can go to AWS, I can go to Google or Azure, and I can pick one. And I can go through contract due diligence and then say, okay, I'm moving to the cloud. The risk perspective when you're going into a contract with a cloud provider is they're generally larger. Any individual client, unless you're incredibly large, doesn't really matter to them. And therefore, the negotiating power to understand their organization is quite low. Once you move to a cloud provider, you're married. Divorce is really hard, if not impossible. So our belief is that from a risk posture, you can look at a market utility like the DTCC and say it's a market utility, and therefore it's a risk, or a very high risk of concentration. But once you onboard yourself to a cloud provider and you're all in on AWS, AWS carries the same exact risk as the market utility. So the goal of this chart at its essence is to break up the components of what are the risks in your third party. And we broke them to criticality, transferability, and substitutability. Is the service that the third provider is providing critical to my business? And if the answer is yes, the next question is how critical? If I have AWS and all my systems are on it, it's critical to the daily operation. If I process securities, and that's my main business, it's critical to my operations. But if I process so few securities that it's not really meaningful to me, then maybe the DTCC isn't as critical. So one is, how important is the third party to my business? And to understand that, you also have to know how important that business service is to your overall organization. The next two components get a little confusing. One is transferability. And that is, how easy is it for me to move from service A to service B? A simple example is, if I'm on AWS and I decide one day that I want to go to Azure, that's not an easy move. It takes a lot of time, money, and investment. So it's not easily transferable. However, if I did decide to move to Azure, Azure is a very good substitute for AWS, meaning they perform exactly the same service. If I go back to my DTCC example, since there's nobody else that performs that service, while I might be easily transferable should another exist, since no other organization exists, there's no substitute. That increases the criticality of the organization. Another way to look at this, and one especially in the financial sector that's important, is payments. We have a lot of payments going through SWIFT. SWIFT is critical to moving money every day. However, the service itself is easily transferable, meaning I can move payments to ACH or FedWire or a host of other payment types. Those payment types are not a good substitute for SWIFT because SWIFT is incorporated into my organization. Going through FedWire requires a terminal and someone typing. Going through ACH takes too much time. So in terms of substitutability, there's nothing quite good there. The reason why we broke all of these apart is we needed to really understand the risk of a third party to an organization once they're onboarded. And we broke the organization types apart to you have a selection. So we called it a selection choice. And we said the selection choice would be if I want to get a broker dealer or an FCM. We then had a limited selection choice category, which would be a web, a cloud provider like an AWS Azure. And then we had a market monopoly or utility, which would be a DTC or a tri-party repo custody. So understanding and breaking apart the risks is important to hear, because too much third-party risk is a tick-the-box exercise, and it can't be anymore because we're all interconnected, we're all relying upon each other, and we really need to understand the risks posed to our organization should our third party fail. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's great perspective, Doug. And I think we just got a question in the inbox, and I'll maybe pass it back to you after the question here, and I'll read it off for you. But just as a reminder for everybody, we do have the open Q&A. Please share those questions. We've planned about 45 minutes worth of content and about 10 minutes of Q&A. So by all means, please share your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can towards the tail end. The question was, how would you think through the risk of service providers that are not providing a service such as executing trades or payments? I think Salesforce, if Salesforce is being used as a contact database for business relationships and potential leads, would this be considered non-business critical, as they are more a support function to normal operations? So Doug and Tom, any thoughts on that one? Happy to provide my thoughts as well.
So Salesforce is a neat one because Salesforce can also integrate with the rest of the organization and all the sort of arms and legs that it has. However, would it be similar? Yeah, it's almost like an Oracle Finance or any other subsystem to your organization. You have choices, much like the example I gave on the cloud providers. But once you bring that system in-house, you're married to it. SAP is a primary example. I remember years ago, people used to complain about the projects. And once SAP was in your organization, nobody ever wanted to get rid of it because it was too much of a bear to bring it in the first place. So I think that it's agnostic of the type of service provided by the third party. It's the characteristics of the service that they provide to your organization, and how hard is it to decouple from them, and how much does your business rely on them. Tom?
Yeah,
I'm just thinking of, Salesforce is a good example. Oracle is another good example as well. They operate in the cloud, and many firms have their general ledgers on that platform, and so you can imagine that some kind of cloud outage with that capability. Not being able to monitor your books and records. I mean, certainly that would be something that's critical to the organization, particularly if you got to close the books at the end of the day as well. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the kind of service that's out there, and like Doug said, how extensive are the tentacles for those kinds of applications into the rest of the organization.
Yeah, and this is an interesting case too, where there is an element of a Salesforce is a good example, where some organizations will have elements of Salesforce integrated into particular business units, and they may not consider it by any given business unit as critical or a high risk third party. But when you then aggregate that across the overall organization, now Salesforce is, maybe not critical, but key across pretty much every business unit. And that do you get into the realm of that because of their scale and operation. Now you've got a third party that you are so reliant upon across all of your business areas that they basically quasi become critical, right? And so that also has to be part of the evaluation. And Doug, back to your point, it really depends on what an organization is doing for you. And I always ask the very direct question of, can you survive without that entity, right? Or can you survive without that service? So if Salesforce goes down for a day, could you survive, from a operations perspective, from a profit and loss, from a balance sheet perspective for a day if they go down? If the answer is yes, you're probably okay. If the answer is no, you kind of know your answer right there, right? And
But I'll push back a little bit there, and the only part I'm really pushing back on, well, two pieces. One is the questions of criticality have become, people start to make them subjective, and it's how do I define critical? And I heard one person who gave the best answer I've heard, and it said, if you turned it off, could you still perform your service? And if the answer is no, it's critical. If you can still do it, it's not critical, no matter how hard. And the point there was to consider lifeboats and workarounds, but also to bring the organization together to define a real meaning of critical. The other thing is, one day after the cyber events that we've seen, I guess I'll challenge you both back. Do we need to think one day, or do we need to think that if we have a cyber event and we're out, look at 4 weeks minimum, look at 4 months maximum, look at somewhere in between as probable being down? And I'm saying that because every regulator says 2 hours, 1 day, whatever they say. We have uptime all the time on our tier 0 applications, or 2-hour recovery. The reality is, if you have a cyber event and you're mandated 2-hour recovery, your CISO can either take 3 weeks to 4 months or fire him, because it is what it is. So the third-party risk elements, I think we need to really consider what's realistic versus aspirational as well. And that's why we're moving towards, at least here, towards a risk-based approach to it, as opposed to a tick-the-box approach.
I think, for me, criticality comes down to financial consequence of loss. So, as you go through all your business processes, you're doing your BIAs, your risk assessments, you're calculating financial consequence of loss over time. I mean, just to be brutally honest, I mean that's one of the key things that are considered. How much am I going to lose, and that goes into your investment decisions. Do I want based on what I could lose over time? Do I want to have an 8-hour RTO, 4-hour, 2 hours, and make those kinds of investments? I think in the financial industry, at least, a lot of it comes just down to cold hard cash, right?
Yeah.
And it's also I was just going to add, I mean, I think the other aspect of all of this is, to a certain extent, there is the level of investment that is required from all entities, not just the FIs, but also the third parties and the fourth parties, to Doug's point earlier on, in terms of the depth of investment that needs to take place here. The reality, and I'm going to share an example more from the home front, but we've got 3 kids under the age of 7. The reality is, my internet at my house is a critical service based on all the Bluey that I need to stream, day over day at any given time. So as you think about what is important to you as an organization, back to Doug's point, you may say, hey, if it's a day for RTO, but it really needs to be 2 hours because that's how we're profitable, that is what you need to then hold everybody accountable to. And I think the other piece of this is, how many test scenarios actually go into the depth of detail that would cover off on what would truly happen if an event actually occurs, right? And I think what we've seen is all these test scenarios show that the RTOs are actually achievable for most organizations in the perfect world. On the flip side of it, we have very real life examples where every cyber event that we've been talking about in today's discussion far exceeds whatever the planned RTO was supposed to be for that event. So somehow there has to be a correlation between what expected RTOs are and what the reality is going forward. And I think that's where the industry as a whole needs to come together and say, again, what is the depth of investment that's required for this to be achievable for all parties involved? And, back to Doug, your cruise ship point, right? In the life rafts, right? Like that, if everybody had to switch to the same backup provider, would that backup provider be able to handle all the volume that's now coming its way to do what it needs to do? And the answer is likely no, right? So we've now just not only had an event at one vendor, but we probably just crashed the other, right? So in a lot of cases, this is the scenario that we have to be planning for, and the testing around this has to be more real time, or more, I'd say not real time, but more realistic in terms of what the RTOs and our recovery objectives should be for people to be, aware of what the real life scenario should be.
Yeah.
And, I go back to, and we've had this discussion several times with a lot of our clients, it's the age-old question of, in a lot of third-party risk management due diligence questionnaires today, there's typically a question around business continuity that says, please provide your BCP plan, right? No vendor or most vendors are not willing to provide their entire plan. It usually translates into, here's our table of contents. If you want to look at it, we can do a WebEx or potentially come on site to review the document. You maybe get an hour to review a 100-page document, and it becomes much more of you're looking for certain key features to check the box. Again, is that a realistic scenario of what would take place if an event occurred? Probably not. And I think we've quickly realized that testing, similar to kind of what we've seen on the financial side in terms of stress testing, has to become much more robust and much more realistic to be able to show what the true output would be.
Yeah, but the testing here also needs to change. We tend to run scenarios and say a cyber event occurred, and then it went here, and then it went here, and then poof, we don't have accessible systems. What would we do now, right? Do we pay the ransom or not pay the ransom, and a whole host of things? The reality on the third party piece here is you almost want to reverse it and test from the incapacitated state, whatever that is, and say, all right, how do I recover, right? I don't have access to my data. What am I doing now? And flip the scenario on its head. Don't start from the beginning, start from the end, because that's what's important. And that's where I think a lot of folks are missing things, because we're worried about what happens when a third party fails, but we test a scenario from inception all the way through. The reality is, let's test it for when they fail and say, how do we recover? And ultimately speaking, I think what we'll find is the concentration risk of that provider and the ability to transfer to another one and the ability for them to have an appropriate substitute and the criticality to our organization is going to drive whether or not that's successful or not. Because if I have a third party that fails, I flip a switch, I'm at a different third party and doing the same service, test is over. But if that's a sort of concentration risk like a market utility, now we really have to be creative and think about how do we recover from this incapacitated state. And I don't think we've been doing a good job of that collectively.
Yep, absolutely. So let's jump to our last slide of content for purposes of moving the discussion along. And Doug, I'll probably revert back to you to just kind of walk through this slide quickly. But we
so this hits at the final 5 states that any scenario will come to. So if you think if I have a cyber event, no matter what the cyber event is, it's going to lead to one of these, most probably loss of or compromise of data, loss of technology, or loss of external third party. But you have an infinite number of scenarios. Those are really good at testing risk. You have 5 end states. That's where we need to start testing to test recoverability. And that's where I think we're not doing a good job as an industry in general. And the reason why we put this slide on and the reason why I think it's so powerful is scenarios are great for thought and great for lessons learned and great to walk through to see how people would act, to understand the deviations. They don't necessarily help in the product of recovery. But if we walked in and the scenario test said, you can't use your computers because everything's locked, what do? It facilitates a whole new way of thinking, and it's more real because eventually on a long enough time horizon, we're all going to experience some sort of of cybersecurity event that locks our systems and we can't do anything. So what do we do from there? So just some thought on that.
Tom, would be curious to see if you're seeing any different trends from an industry lens, kind of from the SIFMA view on where organizations have been shifting on this, and ultimately, to Doug's point, really flipping testing on its head and kind of saying, hey, what can we do to really improve upon what we're looking to achieve with these, what I'll call somewhat routine activities in today's environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And agree with Doug. We do so many exercises in the industry, so many different scenarios. A lot of it are, regulatory driven. The regulators will come in and, show me your top 10 risks, scenarios and the exercises that you've done around that. But really, at the end of the day, there are a limited number of outcomes, and we really agree with Doug, should be shifting, testing towards, the ultimate outcome. It could be lost, compromised data, what have you. But absolutely, there are just too many exercises going on, and they're all kind of, all over the place at this point in time. I think, one of the things our industry is focused on, and just going back to ransomware, really important to have, immutable databases, so that you can recover quickly, and then, make sure we're an important test, talking about RTOs and RPOs is, how quickly, what are your RPOs and how quickly can you recover corrupted data? How quickly can you get back up and operational? And so we are stressing that, firms should have exercises around this, given, the prevalence of ransomware at this point, and how it's impacting. And I think the other thing to take a look at is, again, what's critical to, to your organization, going back into the methodologies our third-party risk management teams use to define, what's tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, just taking a relook at, how those are being calculated, and just making sure from an operational resilience point of view, your TPRM teams are coordinating very closely with your cyber teams and your BCP teams, to align all these exercises and make sure you're all focusing on the right risks and the right outcomes. So yeah, a lot of work to do here, and so back over to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Tom, towards the tail end there, where I think a lot of third-party risk management programs have had to recalibrate their tiering structure, their risk rating structure, for what I'll say is the heightened focus on the operational risk lens over the past several years. Right? And if you look at third-party risk management programs, say 10 years ago, there was plenty of risk methodologies that were so skewed towards data and cyber that, if we were sharing data, it was automatically high risk. And that was kind of the viewpoint in the world at that point. And that has really changed quite a bit over the last 5-10 years, where it's, again, brought in, depending on the organization, you've really pushed a lot of the other risk domains to be either equal or even more important weighted in terms of your scoring methodologies, depending on whether it's operational risk, compliance risk, again, depending on each organization and probably the events that they've had to individually deal with. It really has influenced that drive or that change in terms of the methodology. And ultimately, it's the right way to think about things, but it also then shows, if we're truly focused on the operational resilience component of it, making sure that we have alignment on the level of importance focused on those questions and that scoring, and making sure that that's also driving the right risk behaviors on the back end of the program as well. And the comment that I always say when we're talking about third-party risk with our clients is, if you get the inherent risk process wrong, everything downstream is impacted. Right. So if you're not triggering the right due diligence questionnaires, if you're not triggering the right risk teams to be involved, likely you're going to be missing or potentially not mitigating the applicable risks of a relationship and the services. And that leads to likely downstream impact both in contracting, potentially missed SLAs, KRIs, KPIs, likely misalignment on monitoring activities. It's a really critical component to say, if you get that first question wrong, all the other downstream activities have kind of a downstream waterfall impact of potentially being off as well. So if I was recommending anything to the industry, focus on the inherent risk process and making sure that it's capturing the right risks, capturing the right output, and that it's triggering the right activities. And ultimately that may require a look at who's involved and what they're doing, but ultimately that's what's going to drive an effective third-party risk management program, and also bringing in the other risk methodologies into the equation, such as operational resilience, such as cyber, such as compliance, whatever it might be. So
I'd also add in the simplest way I think about the third-party risk is just concentration risk. How reliant am I on that provider? And I equate it back to the internet. The internet has the least concentration risk by design of any system we've put together. You can send a data packet from here to wherever, and it'll find its way there through an infinite number of paths. So if any path fails by the original design, I think it was from ARPANET is what it was called, due to nuclear war, how do we communicate? No concentration risk. The higher that concentration risk, the more reliant on that third party or that process or that service. And that's where the risk inherently lies, and that's where the focus should be to the organization. The other side of that equation should be, how critical is the service that third party supports to the organization as a whole? And if you take those two components very simply, it drives the risk to your firm.
Great point. So with that, we're approaching the end of our time today. Maybe I'll ask the speakers here to give maybe a couple quick summary thoughts or key takeaways, and we'll wrap up here. So Tom, any key last minute thoughts here?
Yeah, I think what we've seen some of the most sophisticated organizations do over the past couple of years, under the umbrella of operational resilience, is bring a lot of these organizations together. Your third-party risk teams, your cyber, BCP, your DR teams. I mean, in the past, all these teams tended to operate pretty much independently and report to different parts of the organization. But again, some of the most sophisticated firms we deal with have started to reorganize around operational resilience, bring all these teams together, the incident management teams, making sure they're all looking at risk the same way. But if there are outages or issues, everybody knows where to go and what to do, and who's responsible. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you, Doug.
I guess my 2 points are always on risk is one, O'Toole's comment on Murphy's Law, which was Murphy was an optimist. Things will go wrong, and they'll probably go wrong in places you didn't think about or didn't look. And sure enough, it'll pop up, especially in the third party space where you have less perspective. The other thing is, let's always make sure we're looking at risk and not a tick the box exercise. A tick the box exercise just is a compliance exercise. A risk exercise is really looking at, where can I have financial loss, to Tom's point earlier? Where can I hurt my reputation? Where can I hurt my firm? And I think that's a bit more important to look at than anything. And just so you know, we had a question come in, Brian. I'll pass it over to you to read through.
Yep. Yeah, it's what comes first, TPRM program or the OR recovery plan? So do you want to cover that one quick, Doug, or do you want me to?
You go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll use this as kind of my wrap-up comments then as well. So, I think my general recommendation is, again, these programs need to be talking together all the time, and there is no right or wrong answer on which one comes first. To me, this comes back to, where are your critical business services, understanding truly as an organization what is critical to you, and then what third parties influence or impact that ability to deliver those products or services to the marketplace. And inherently that should link into your TPRM program. And back to Doug and Tom's point, if we're asking the right questions for that top 5% for the within your third-party risk management program, you should then be getting to a point where you've got an understanding of who your key third parties are. And when I say key, again, I'm using kind of the global terminology of critical, important, whatever nomenclature you want to use here. But whichever ones are the most important to you from an operations perspective, being able to then translate that to understanding what your exit strategies need to be, what your monitoring strategies need to be, what your day-to-day risk oversight needs to be. All of those things are connected together. And again, if you're focusing on 50% of your portfolio with consistent questionnaires and consistent activity, you're probably doing it wrong. You really need to focus on the top 5, top 10% of what's really important to you. And that's where your attention should be. So with that being said, what I'll also just wrap up quickly with is, and one thing we haven't talked about today is technology and using technology to be able to help monitor and identify where challenges are taking place. And certainly what I'll just add is the more and more programs integrate all of their risk management methodologies to be able to talk to each other, such as RCSA and third-party risk management, such as CSA and Ops Resilience, all of these programs need to talk to each other, and having consistent technology to be able to make those data points connect is really, really important. And then again, leveraging contracts and the benefit of you as an FI really needs to drive how you monitor those third-party relationships and connecting that back to the day-to-day business services as well. So with that, I know we're almost at time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Tom and Doug for the wonderful insights. As a reminder, you can connect with our speakers by visiting the bios window on your screen. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars soon, and please enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.